was a good, very good slide actually, is that an extrapulmonary cause of the letter S is when you really have to worry about the chest wall, which makes sense, like pancreatitis, severe trauma, yeah, right, they get very tense after, and so their chest wall relaxes and collapses and stuff.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
All right, Robert. Did you see what she was walking out and give her a
What is that?
gift card? She said she was there. Yeah, it's bad. Just put on those virtual reality things and walk around like this. Right. What did you do?
I didn't stay, actually, I watched.
Oh, okay. Which was. Yeah, it didn't change. You guys are just so smart. No, it didn't change. No, I saw that. I just said we have my COPD talking. It's kind of interesting. It was just so much concern. One of the.
Do you have a polling question?
No, I don't have it.
Okay.
Anything?
Yeah, I have one because, Dan
Yeah.
suggested we added one. I didn't know I should do it. Then if, we get any bags and we didn't get any notepads.
I know, no, exactly, no, that's.
So this obscures, I don't have to look at me, my face, but this obscures.
We can just move it
Why
a
do we
little bit.
need this? I guess we do need it, don't we?
Yeah, otherwise, there's one
Yeah,
there.
that's one over there, yeah, so why do we need this one?
I know, well, last time, I think probably get it down.
Let me just see. Oh,
All the answers after the session.
Yeah,
now, this, so he's gonna have to go into this is the last session, so how do we get in?
last session.
Yeah, that looks like it's the finish of the last session.
So,
Somebody from here, there's an audio visual guy was there.
oh,
just
is he?
stepped out.
He stepped out, okay, let's ask him about this. Okay, and I think I'd like to do, we can see, unless you want to see. That's what's yours, is you can see the slides. I guess it's available.
I guess the other two, well, the,
Yeah, that's a good idea. Excellent.
it didn't seem to like that, move, but I'm sure he'll adjust. It's,
No, we just want to move it out of the way, because otherwise,
yeah,
you can't see it.
So how do you get to the, first one?
To your slides?
Yeah.
Are these yours?
No, this is not, this isn't the right,
Oh.
session.
Next one, yeah, next
The next
session.
session?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so we'll just go
Yeah.
here, okay.
Yeah, well, this
Okay.
is your, whoever's
Okay.
presenting first, obviously,
Okay,
yeah.
excellent, okay, very good.
oh, perfect. Nice. Okay. That's good.
You might like this, if you don't, you can change it back, but what I would do is duplicate the slideshow to get it.
I see bigger. Yeah, I don't have anything on the notes that I need to read.
This is your, here needed. A red dot, laser pointer.
What's that?
The laser pointer, the red dot.
Oh, red's laser. Nice.
If you need it, I don't know.
No, that's good.
A lot of
And
groups
then,
are asking for them.
yeah, right.
You could use mouse as a pointer.
Yeah, and I think I'll use the
advance,
the advance right left, and then good, and then we've got the audience response thing in there. I think that pops a slide in.
Audience responses on the phone, isn't it?
Yes, but as part of the presentation, does that automatically create a slide? Is it the second slide in the presentation?
Yeah, it should
I was
be.
told that it would.
Okay, yeah, I think that that'll be the case. Just to remind
So I
folks.
tried to do it, but then I got a message saying, if you are doing that, then you should have already submitted it long ago.
I think they was suggested, but really it's not a big deal. They all, yeah, it's fine. We could just shout out to the audience too. Just have them raise their hand.
I'm impressed that there's this many people that follow.
Yeah, well, that's good. This is, I think people are asking about this in the clinics, and so we're looking for answers here.
At the end of the session, we'll have all the
Then we'll have them all. Yeah,
You should push your,
so Irfan Rahman does a lot on sleep rings. Oh, Sandy Piranha.
Yeah,
yeah, Sandy Piranha. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh yeah, I think she was planning on coming, but she's here. This is something I've been giving educational talks all over the region. So this is, I'm very grateful to be invited. Well, inhalational toxicology is the broad field.
Not many people.
Yeah, it's kind of it's a tough field to follow because there's so many studies that come out just every single week.
And it's all in all these, none of this is mainstream.
Exactly.
Or mainstream for us. You know, for us.
Exactly. Yeah, they're all behind paywalls
Yeah,
and
so
all
man,
with
you
articles.
have no idea how to
Right. Yeah, and the general public's trying to get to these articles. They can't get past these paywalls, and they're wondering if we're hiding something from them. It's just, it's tough. Tough field. Professor Taskin, I have one of your studies in here, a nice prospective one on e-cig exposure, folks that used e-cigs and did CT scans, following up everything. That's an interesting
This
one.
was, and it was Ricardo Pelosi?
Yes, yeah, Pelosi.
Yeah, I was peripherally involved in it. I was a little uncertain as to whether or not I should put my name in.
Oh, well, it looked like it was well done. And,
Yeah.
it was good to see the natural history of everything with it. But.
Like the we'll find out. Well, I don't know that the immunosuppressants, if they're background therapy, things like what background therapy they're on, but those that have an certain process.
one of them,
The skin tends to improve as the country streams.
maybe just
I think the best indicator of the time is, yeah, we have 4 more.
Oh yeah, 4 minutes. All right. Well, I won't make folks nervous in the audience.
It's a, well, I'm gonna investigate you. Problem to do that is you can get through the sample.
sorry to eventually you want to have all these.
Competing benefits and risks, competing potential benefits, and competing risks.
Someone's not talking about e-cigs, it turns into a 30-minute discussion of how it is assuming this 12 day this could be.
I think I'm okay. Yep.
Got my tie. Enough. I packed everything up, checked it at the hotel, and I just realized walking here that I don't think it matters.
I came down and I checked it out. I just came this afternoon.
I guess it's practically there. I think that's So it's practically 5 p.m. I think we'll begin. My name is Don Tashkin. I'm a. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I guess if you need the audio-visual person to turn this on, or is it? Okay. My name is Don Tashkin. When the audiovisual guy gets back, he'll turn this on. So I'm a pulmonologist at UCLA, and I want to welcome you all to this late afternoon session. Is it on? Where? Oh, can you hear me better? Okay. I guess I'm only about a millimeter from the. Okay. I hope the last.
Smoking session.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So I want to welcome you all to this late afternoon session on e-cigarettes, hookah, and marijuana. These are three inhaled substances, the use of which, the prevalence of use of which has increased considerably recently, generating some concerns about their impact on public health, which we're going to be addressing during this session. It's my pleasure also to welcome the faculty for this program. So on my left is Dan Croft from the University of Rochester, New York. And on my right is, I have to get this correct, is Sri Hari Veeraraghavan?
Yeah.
I did it?
Yeah.
Good, okay. Okay. We're going to be, so we'll start out with the, and we do have a couple of polling questions for you you'll need to use your phone for. So we'll start out with the first presentation by Dr. Croft, the role of e-cigarettes in health, addiction, and disease. One other thing, I think that in view of the time constraints, I think we'll hold all the questions until the last presentation has been made.
All right. Thank you, and hello to our online viewers as well. And this is the live polling prompt that we'll have a couple questions to answer during the presentation. 1 in 9 high school students in the U.S. have used e-cigarettes in the past 30 days. So for our patients and for our families, it's important to understand these devices. I have no financial conflicts of interest, but with e-cigarettes, it's important to overshare rather than undershare. I dislike big tobacco, so I'm from the tobacco testing ground of Indiana, and I'm part of a Sinter grant for flavored tobacco products, as well as a consultant for the tobacco-free Finger Lakes in New York. And when we talk about e-cigarettes and smoking cessation, I do want to be clear that that is not an FDA-approved use for smoking cessation. So the objectives today, we need to take a look at whether there's a gateway influence of e-cigarettes leading to combustible cigarette use. Also look at the safety profile of the e-cigarette, and look at the efficacy of e-cigarettes in smoking cessation. So these are the family of electronic nicotine delivery systems, ENDS, which e-cigarettes are a part of. So you see all the way over on your left, we have the first generation. These look just like cigarettes. They have low voltage, low nicotine concentrations, and as you move to the second generation, the third generation, what you see is larger batteries, more power, larger capacity to store nicotine, and when you get to the fourth generation, you start pushing the limits of the resistance within the heating coil, where you have low resistance within the heating coil to generate higher power and more vapor. Which can become unstable. And then all the way on the right, a relatively new product is the Juul. It's a cartridge-based system that we'll talk about. This is an $18 billion industry and counting. So this is no cottage industry, and it is not going anywhere. So we need to understand what it is. Juul dominates the market. Over 50% market share belongs to Juul. Some estimate upwards of 70%. Incredibly popular. The Juul pod, which is this area here at the front of the Juul device, contains highly concentrated nicotine salts. about 59 milligrams of nicotine in a milliliter for the high dose, 35 for the lower dose. And that equates to about one pod being equivalent to a pack of cigarettes. Now, when you take apart that top of the Juul pod, the user pulls on the mouthpiece, inhales, that triggers a microprocessor that heats up a wick here and a metal coil that heats the nicotine, which is stored here, and vaporizes it. To be honest, when you look at e-cigarettes, the majority of the device is battery. It's all battery. And you see they're incredibly popular among youth. They're very easy to hide. You can hide it just in your shirt pocket and use it when the teacher turns their back. Bathrooms in high schools are now called Juul rooms. So you get a sense that it's not your daddy's high school. Now, the problem with youth is that it looks like they read half the reports on Juul, because 63% of youth were unaware that every single Juul pod has nicotine in it. There are no nicotine-free Juul pods. So, why make a big deal about nicotine delivery? Well, it has everything to do with addiction. So let's take a look at our trusty combustible cigarette, now called an analog cigarette. You see why they have addiction is that you get that high peak. It really, with that pre and post episode, you get that high peak in nicotine. It releases dopamine. That's what fuels addiction. Now, or those early weak generation ones, poor nicotine delivery here, and it gets a little better. But now look, over on the edge, we have our modified devices, and which includes Juul. These can match and even exceed the combustible nicotine delivery, which is impressive because that is the whole purpose of a combustible cigarette. So with that, you can imagine that the potential for addiction is certainly there. Now, let's say someone tries to start with one of these low nicotine devices. They can go one of two ways. They can either say, well, this isn't the experience I want. I want to go back to combustible cigarettes, or they progress up through the ladder of the higher nicotine devices and with more power. So Big Tobacco makes exclusively these weak e-cigarettes, and my suspicion would be that they are hoping that the direction is back to combustible. So with these high nicotine concentrations, what does this do for folks that are these teens that are using these e-cigarettes? What about when they go on to smoke cigarettes? Now, notice that I'm not talking about if. There have been many studies that show there is an association, usually odds ratios 2 to 5, in terms of folks that use e-cigarettes going on to smoke combustible cigarettes. Now, what I want to focus on here is we have these different nicotine levels of the e-cigarette, low, medium, and high. And you see, by the time you get to a high nicotine device, you have the people that were vaping these high nicotine concentrations smoked about 7 times as many cigarettes per day compared to those vaping a no nicotine e-cigarette. So pretty striking that the intensity, you see some increased intensity there. So with this nicotine delivery, are people actually using these? Well, let's take a look. First, we have on the y-axis the prevalence percentage, and we have years here on the x-axis. First, let's take a look at combustible cigarette use in the blue. So the blue line here, and it's going down, from 16 to about 7.6 over these past 6 years. Now look at the orange thick line of e-cigarette use has skyrocketed up to 16% in 2015, tapered off a little bit, but is sustaining about 11.7. Now, 11.7%. That represents 1.7 million students. And while some folks think this is even an underestimate because they didn't include a question specifically on Juul. And as kids call it juuling instead of vaping now, there was thought that there could be some confusion. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt that the kids knew that they were using e-cigarettes, so I think it's pretty accurate, but it could be more. So I want to use during this talk the National Academies as my backstop because we can only present so many studies here. The National Academies reviewed all the literature just published in January 2018, And they have different levels of evidence, from conclusive all the way down to no available evidence. And what they found was substantial evidence of this gateway phenomenon, that they have symptoms of dependence on nicotine. And they did think, based on those studies, there's less than combustible, but still symptoms of dependence were present. Now, they also saw that use increased the risk of combustible tobacco use, and that's what I had mentioned, that's pretty well established. Now, there is moderate evidence, at that time, increased frequency and intensity. The study I just showed you was after the National Academies released their study, so that was adding to this evidence, the strength of the evidence for the frequency and intensity of future combustible use. So now we'll get to our first question, if you have your clickers ready. And so let's see, what's that?
You may have to go back and.
Do we have, let's see, advance to open poll. Are you able to? Sorry.
Click. What about clicking on that blue arrow?
Yeah, I think we might have missed the boat on this one. Well, let's see. Yeah, when we go next, we advance to the slide, so that's okay. Well, what do you think? Yay, nay? Does this happen? It was just true, false. Yes? All right. Well, then we've got some folks that know a lot about diacetyl in the e-liquids. So on the y-axis here, we have the mass of diacetyl in each e-cigarette cartridge and the different flavors on the right here. So tobacco flavor, a brown flavor, whatever that is, cocktail flavor, you see is pretty high. You've got a high mass of that diacetyl. The peach schnapps had 10 times the amount as the others. But what I want to point out is that combustible cigarettes have even more. And so they have about 340 micrograms per cigarette. And if you conservatively estimate, combustible cigarettes have more diacetyl than e-cigarettes do in general. And there haven't been any cases of bronchiolitis obliterans reported in cigarette smokers. There's been a single case report for electronic cigarettes that was biopsy proven, but this is by no means established. It makes for great headlines though, but I just want to caution us that we really have to wait till the evidence catches up to this to make this a big finding, because it can affect our credibility if we just repeat this because we find it interesting. Now, the group Pelosa et al. Did a prospective study where they looked at e-cig users that just used e-cigs and then looked at the CT chest findings over time. They didn't see any ground glass. They didn't see any changes that would suggest that they're heading towards a bronchiolitis picture or an organizing pneumonia picture. So this is still to be determined here. But with toxicity, it's all about these e-liquids, right? Because there's 14,000 or more e-liquids right now. So this was a nice study that just tried to propose a way to organize it. So you've got 14,000 e-liquids in this outer band. You look at what they do with the cells. You look at what is within those e-liquids. Then you select a few and then repeat those studies. Try to look more into the mouse models. And then, of course, you have to aerosolize it. You have to you have to vaporize it, and then look at that whole aerosol to see what its effect is on the body. So this is where we've been, taken the mouse models, human bronchial cells, and what we've seen is inflammation and oxidative stress. Those are really two of the key findings out of many of these studies, is that these cells are under stress when they're exposed to these liquids and vapors. So the next step is in vivo human studies. So that's what our colleagues here, Rydell, did in early 2018. They took a group of about 45 e-cigarette users, and they looked at the neutrophil response within their lungs. So they had them inhale the e-cig vapor, then they induced sputum, and then looked at what the different factors within there. Now, the factor I want to point out is this MUC5AC, which leads to increased mucus within the airway, indicating that the airways were irritated by the e-cigarette. Now, also, though, they showed that there was increase of this netosis, which is a process by which neutrophils kill bacteria. And as you can see, you have a mess of different proteins, elastases, enzymes inflammatory mediators out there as part of that process, but there's not an infection, they just use e-cigs. So this, in theory, could increase the risk for lung damage and COPD if this unchecked inflammation is happening. In fact, the fact that there was increased mucus is one of those signs that there's inflammation heading towards COPD. So that's a concern. That's by no means established. The Ghosh et al. In this summer also saw that they did bronchoscopies on folks that used e-cigs and also saw this MUC5AC increase. So this is starting to develop within the literature. Interestingly, if you'd say these net osis is meant to trap bacteria, you'd think, well, they're going to be able to fight infection better, right? That's what you would think, but the studies on infection actually showed that some folks with e-cig exposure and mice especially were worse at clearing infection. So it's dysregulated response to infection. And then these nets, this inflammation was actually seen in the peripheral blood where these neutrophils were activated. Now, if it's in the peripheral blood, that goes systemically. So can that cause vasculitis, vascular disease? That's where research is heading. So, novel dangers. Unfortunately, these e-cigarette batteries can explode when they're in unstable conditions. A man in Florida died of a projectile wound to his head. They found this logo in his brain, so there is no question that that is what killed him. There have been a few thousand explosions and burns over the past couple of years. Unfortunately, an 18-month-old child died of a fatal cardiac arrhythmia after ingesting e-liquid. Since that time, child-proof containers are now required for all e-liquids. And now people are vaping other substances. You can put whatever you want into that, into your e-cig, and people are putting hash oil in there. This idea of whether that would lead to a lipoid pneumonia has been raised. I think that's a valid point, because if you have burning hot oil going into the lungs, that could cause some real trouble. So the National Academies, again, summed up the evidence here. Conclusive, their highest level of evidence, that there is incredible variability among the devices, that there are toxic substances in the liquids and vapor, mainly related to the aldehydes, the flavoring compounds. Secondhand exposure has nicotine in it, and folks that have been exposed to that secondhand vape have cotinine in their urine, showing that they were exposed to nicotine at low levels, but still, if folks that are pregnant really should not be around others that vape. Now, explosions can occur, and the poisonings can occur as well. Now, complete switching in some studies has shown that it does lower your exposure to these chemicals, so that was meant to be something they thought could be positive. And substantial evidence of that: inflammation, oxidative stress, endothelial cell dysfunction, metal exposure, because remember that coil that's in the e-liquid is heated, and small bits of metal that are in there get into your e-liquid and vaporized into your lung. And acrolein exposure is also present. That gets into the spectrum of DNA damage and potential carcinogenic effects of these. But again, none of these are proven in terms of the cancer link there, but that is something that's being watched very closely. So I'm worried about what's going to happen.
Wait till they answer.
Okay. Well, I think you're supposed to advance the slide to open this poll. Let's see what happens. Just think of your answer here. How often do you mention these E6 to your patients as for smoking cessation? All the time, sometimes never. Yep. Perfect. Yeah, so another bust. But just something to think about. There's no right answer here. The problem is we don't have any conclusive evidence. You know, as a smoking cessation agent, we have limited evidence through all the studies. Now, there is substantial evidence that the nicotine delivery can be equivalent, and that, you know, in theory could be a good thing, because you can trade your combustible cigarette for an e-cigarette. Now, there's moderate evidence that using e-cigs with nicotine would be more effective. As you can imagine, you're trying to replace the nicotine from your combustible cigarette with the nicotine in an electronic cigarette. And the overall way to frame this is this harm reduction versus perpetuation of nicotine addiction, right? and titration is important. One of the problems I have with Juul is that it only comes in 2 levels, both of them pretty high nicotine. So imagine you have a patient that tries to step down to the next level of Juul and then is looking around wondering how they're going to get from 35 milligrams of nicotine all the way down to 0, and they're probably going to need your help. You're going to have to give them patches, gum, one of the FDA-approved things to get off of Juul. So it's possible. So when a patient asks you, whether they should use e-cigarettes, this is a great moment to bond with your patient. They want to quit. That's a big step in quitting smoking. Focus on these FDA-approved methods. That's a reasonable thing. This is the American Cancer Society's approach, by the way, which I agree with. But if they fail that, just as long as the patient understands this, e-cigarettes are not FDA approved. There are fewer toxins, but as I mentioned, we've got some long-term health effects being studied, and that they need to switch completely. They cannot be dual users in that they use e-cigarettes and continue to use combustible cigarettes. That is not a recipe for success for smoking cessation, and they need to plan to quit that e-cig. They need your help, and you can quit it the same way. That's the great thing. Use the same things. It's all just nicotine addiction. Yep. And then which to recommend? This is the impossible thing because of the brands and the flavors. They would just need to find someone they trust. So the FDA regulates manufacturing, advertising, sale, and the components. And this August, they were meant to have this new law in effect where they could not sell any ends without FDA approval, but they've moved that back to sometime in 2022. So that's not very helpful. And being sued by, the FDA is being sued now because of that decision. And breaking news, the FDA just in the past month wants to address this epidemic, and just a week ago they stopped by Juul headquarters and obtained thousands of files related to their marketing to teens. So let's see what happens there. To conclude, e-cigarettes have fewer toxins than combustible cigarettes, but the regulation is lacking. Inflammation, immune effects, long-term health effects, and other unique dangers require further study. It doesn't appear as though e-cigarettes are any more effective than FDA-approved smoking cessation methods, and potentially could lead to perpetuation of nicotine addiction. You have to regulate these products for safety and prevent underage use, and that no non-smoking children or adults should ever use e-cigarette. There's no reason. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. A very illuminating presentation. So now we're going to move on to the second talk, which will be delivered by Dr. Now I have to do Vera Garvin. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Good enough,
Yeah.
okay. And
If I can get to my.
the
let me
topic
see.
of his talk, okay.
That's, all right, that's easier.
There you go.
Topic of his talk, hazards and effects of hookah, shisha on health and disease.
Thanks, that was a great talk, a lot of data. So mine is going to be mostly hearsay. So that's the data. No disclosures, right? We as doctors did a great job, during this regular smoking cigarette. I'm hoping that we don't match this this time around. Right. A lot of you have seen hookah. Some may not. Let me make sure. Yeah. So it contains, a water bowl. There's a bowl in the bottom. It's got a lot of water in it. And it's got a body, which is a little long tube. On top of it is a head. And there's a little space where you can put the tobacco in. And there's a foil paper. You put a foil paper on top of it. You put a little bit of hole in there. And then you place a charcoal on top of it. And then this is the hose through which the person inhales through the mouthpiece. You light the charcoal, and when the charcoal is lit, the tobacco gets heated up, and when they suck through the mouthpiece, the fumes go through the tube, through the water, bubbles up, and then gets out through the to the mouth. Picture is worth 1,000 words, but an actual thing is even better. So if you want, we can hang out later if you want. So hookah originated in India and Persia more than 1,000 years ago. There's lots of different names, nargile, argay, shisha, hubble bubble. Sometimes it's referred as water pipe tobacco smoking in medical literature. The tobacco, as I said, is usually sweetened with molasses or fruit. There's a lot of flavors added. And it's typically smoked in groups. It's mostly a social event. The unique features is, even though I brought it today, it's non-portability. So it's somewhere, so never leave home without it, It's intermittent use. It's not like a cigarette. It's not smoking all day long. There's a lot of other sensory cues because it's a social event. They hang out with other people. They drink alcohol. There's probably some restaurant and things like that. The other thing is there's prolonged smoking sessions. These last for an hour or two, and so the impact is much more. Like I said, it's usually a social event. There's a lot of myths associated with hookah. It's thought to be less harmful, supposed to be less addictive. Because the smoke goes through the water, it's thought to be filtered out the toxins, and so it's not as much as a problem. It's thought to have less nicotine than conventional cigarettes, and there's some thought that the added flavors impart some health benefit. As you can see the title, all of these are myths, right? So, once it gets into the New York Times, then it's truth, right? So there's an article from New York Times from more than 20 years ago. This quotes somebody from, I guess, Turkey. It says, "Smoking a nargile is nothing like smoking a cigarette," 71-year-old pensioner said as he looked up from his pipe. "Cigarettes are for nervous people, competitive people, people on the run. When you smoke a nargile, you have time to think. It teaches you patience and tolerance and gives you an appreciation of good company. Nargile smokers have a much more balanced approach to life and cigarettes." Now it's in the New York Times, it's true, right? So now you know what to do, right? Yeah. So, but the facts are different, right? So a typical session is at least an hour, if not more. The number of puffs is probably 200 per session. The volume of smoke inhaled is about 90,000 ml. I don't know how much, maybe fills this room, right? So if this is a cigarette smoke, and that's a hookah smoke, right? So that's so in one hookah session, smokers may inhale up to 100 cigarettes, right? Yeah, there's much amount of smoke in there, right? So take it, Jewel, okay? Yeah. So applied optics, I know that's your favorite journal too. It's mine too. I read it every month, right? So there was this piece in 1972 talked about the exact temperature of hell cannot be computed, but must be less than 444.6, because at that temperature, sulfur, which is where it's supposed to be boiling, would all become into gas. So it's somewhere less than 444.6, and then we have data to show that on top of the hookah, it's at least 447.3 degrees centigrade. So if there's one thing you remember, at least from my part of the lecture, hookah is hotter than hell, right? I want you to remember that. So the question is this a problem, right? So we have all this thing about hookah. Is it really a problem, right? This is a table from New England Journal from a paper from last year, just looking at tobacco use by adults and youths in the U.S. in 2013 and 14. This little crowded slide, but you can look at hookah here. Ever use, age 15 to 17, is about 11%, which is pretty significant. Less than 17. And use in the past 30 days, which is current use for 18 to 24-year-old, which is pretty much the demographic for hookah, is about 30% for cigarettes, is about 11% for hookah. So it's not a small number. A significant number of youth, especially somewhere between 16 to 30, use hookah. What about is another paper published in Family Practice this year, use in college and non-college young adults. This is an online survey. It has got its own limitation, but that's where kids are these days, so we got to go find there, right? So adults not in college, ever use, again, is close to 30%, and current use is on 3%. Whereas in college, ever use is about 35%, but the current use is about 7%. So it's a big thing in college. It's a lot of use, right? What about medical students? We say other college students, they don't know anything. We know medical students are better, right? So this is a study from, again, this year from BMC Public Health. It's about 5% use in medical students in Germany and Hungary. What about high school and middle school, right? So at least 1 million middle school and high school used hookah in the last 30 days. And that is significant. You know, this is 2016 data, and that's middle school student and high school students. This is about 6 years from 2001 to 2016. As you can see, in middle school students, there's a slight increase. Maybe in the last 2 years, there's maybe cut down, you know, maybe because of Juul, they all moved to Juul, right? And the same thing with high school students, there was a significant increase. In the last 2015 and 16, there's a slight decline, right? So even in high school, there's a significant amount. Remember, at least in Juul, they can just sneak it in the bathroom, but this is difficult, and so it's all, you know, happens. You know. So the question is this a passing fad? You know, does this happen just in high school, middle school, and college, and then it drops off, so it's not a big deal? Unfortunately, you know, that doesn't seem to be the case, because this is a study, again, published this year from Texas, and, you know, Texas college students. What they did was they asked students about their use every 6 months. So some new students come in, old students leave. So every 6 months they're saying what their smoking history is in terms of all the other electronic cigarettes, regular cigarettes, hookah, and everything. What they found was in the previous 6 months, if they had said they are smoking hookah, by the time they asked them next time, in the next 6 months, they had a significant increase in use of either a combustible cigarette, which is a regular cigarette, or an electronic cigarette. So there's a chance that they graduate from hookah to regular cigarettes, you know, with time, once they get out of the, you know, college dorm, right? So what's the science behind it? What's happening actually when they smoke cigarettes, or smoke the hookah? So Eisenberg did this study almost 10 years ago. They took a bunch of participants. They made them smoke either hookah for 45 minutes or one cigarette, and they did multiple venous blood samples. As you can see, the carboxyhemoglobin, so carbon monoxide levels, are so much higher, you know, with smoking hookah, considering, which means there's a lot more exposure, and probably some of it comes from the charcoal as well, compared to a regular cigarette. Same thing with, same study with nicotine. There was no big difference in peak nicotine, but the overall area under the curve was much higher for hookahs, because with the cigarette, it goes up and then comes down after, you know, a while, whereas with hookah, there's continued to increase over time. So over time, there's significantly more exposure to nicotine, which is concerning for addiction. There's some other studies, you know, where they use a machine-generated smoke. They took 4.7 grams of tobacco, which is apparently the usual stuff they put on the top, versus one cigarette, which is usually a gram or less. They looked at the amount of nicotine, carbon monoxide, and tar. As you can see, there's a significant difference. The nicotine is probably about less than 2 times, but the carbon monoxide is significantly high. Again, maybe because of the charcoal use, and again, definitely tar use as well, also is significantly higher. So what about the effects of cardiovascular system? This, again, American Journal of Cardiology study published this year. They looked at 48 young hookah smokers and smoking just hookah, nothing else. They measured parameters before and after. And as expected, the heart rate went up, plasma nicotine concentration, exhaled carbon monoxide, all those things went up. But also pulse wave velocity, augmentation index, as well as systolic and diastolic blood pressure went up. And these are all thought to reflect significant stiffening of the arteries, which is apparently very similar to what happens with cigarettes. So the cardiovascular pathology is somewhat similar to what happens in cigarettes as well. What about lung function? This is from a while ago. It's a meta-analysis of several studies which showed there is a decrease in FEV1 with hookah smoking, and FEV1 FVC ratio also decreased with hookah smoking. What about cancer? This is, again, a study published last year. This is interesting. They searched and they found people who smoke only hookah. And these are studies where there's only hookah, not cigarettes and hookah. There's a significant increase, odds ratio of between 4 to 5 increase between hookah smoking and cancer and lung cancer. The same thing for esophageal cancer, a little more studies, and it's about odds ratio of about 3 to 4. So there's significant, all the things we talk about in terms of cigarette smoking is associated with hookah smoking as well. There are lots of other effects: respiratory illness, low birth weight, periodontal disease, obviously. Secondhand smoke, there's a lot of data coming out of people working in hookah bars and then having increased amount of nicotine in their blood, carbon monoxide in the blood, etc. There's increased risk of infectious disease transmitted because there's some sharing of the mouthpiece. There's some case reports of things which we don't know what's happening, necrotizing granulomatous inflammation in the lung and things like that. So the other problems is association with cigarette, right? This we thought to be a gateway to cigarette. They smoke this during high school and college, and then they're addicted to nicotine, and when they leave, they end up, picking up cigarette, and then people try to use it as a way out of cigarette. It's thought to be better than cigarettes, and people try to switch from cigarettes to hookah, and there's a problem. And there's also a strong association with alcohol and marijuana and other things with hookah use. We all know tobacco is, kills. It's an epidemic. There's probably 1.3 billion smokers in the world, and more than 5 million die from tobacco illness every year. 10% of them are from secondhand smoke, and that's more deaths than HIV, TB, and malaria combined. So that's a lot. We had made a lot of strides in decreasing smoking in the U.S., and that's for adults and that's for students. The concern is with all the electronic cigarettes and hookah and such, whether any of this is going to reverse, which may not be a good thing. So these are all the Yelp-rated hookah bars. So around San Antonio. So in case you want to check out what I said today, then you can go. Right? Thank you. That's my last one.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. I don't think I'm going to be able to make you laugh as much. Let's see if I can get this. Here we go. Yeah. So now we're going to switch to marijuana. Let's see whether this. Okay, and display setting. Duplicate. Okay, so what about the effects of marijuana on the lung? So, oh yes, there is a, I don't know how to activate this, but this was the, these have no disclosures. I don't run a dispensary. This is the question, but I don't know how to advance to open the poll. So we can't do that. It does say advanced slide, so the poll. So this is so habitual marijuana smoking is associated with COPD, chronic bronchitis, lung cancer, pneumonia, none of the above. Doesn't work. Okay, we'll find out. Okay, so why might this be a problem? Well, marijuana use in this country is increasing, probably as a consequence of the fact that most of the states in the U.S. have now essentially legalized or decriminalized marijuana use either for medicinal and or recreational use. So this might generate some concern because the smoke contents of marijuana mirror those of tobacco. If you look at the volatile phase components, they're very similar both qualitatively and quantitatively. You see some very toxic substances here, aldehydes, choline, and various nitrosamines. It's just a fraction of the toxic material that emanates from tobacco smoke and marijuana smoke. If you look at the particulate phase components, they're qualitatively similar with the major exception that marijuana contains THC and about 60 THC-related or cannabinoid compounds, whereas, of course, tobacco does not. Tobacco contains nicotine and marijuana does not. If we look at the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, in fact, there's a higher concentration. There's actually more than one chemical analytic study that shows this, higher concentrations of these benzpyrene, which is probably the most important human carcinogen, and benzanthracene in marijuana than in tobacco. So since we know that the major pulmonary effects of tobacco smoking are COPD and lung cancer, is there a possibility that marijuana, even though marijuana is smoked in smaller amounts than tobacco, might lead to similarly increased risks? Maybe not as much as with tobacco, but nonetheless maybe significantly increased risk compared to not smoking marijuana or tobacco. So let's first look at that's not an unreasonable hypothesis. So let's first look at the evidence in the literature, and it's fairly limited, concerning the association between marijuana and or tobacco smoking and symptoms of chronic bronchitis. There have been a half dozen studies that have systematically addressed this question, and most of the results of most of the studies show that yes, there is an increase in cough, sputum, and wheeze, and this increase in cough and sputum conforms to the definition of chronic bronchitis: increased cough and sputum most days for at least 3 months out of the year for 2 or more years. And so 6 of the most of these studies, I guess there are 7, right? So 5 out of the 7 do show increased symptoms of chronic bronchitis. And the underlying pathology would suggest that's it's not an unexpected outcome. So if you do bronchoscopy in regular smokers of marijuana, what you generally see is increased swelling and vascularity. As a matter of fact, you can biopsy, show the swelling is due to edema, the redness is due to increased number in cells of blood vessels, and also not shown here, but in other sections, there are increased secretions as well. Histopathologically, there is a lot of destruction of the ciliate epithelium that we see, the normal columnar ciliate epithelium in a non-smoker, replaced by goblet cells, mucus-secreting surface epithelial cells or basal cells, and a third of the patients have squamous metaplasia. So if you destroy the ciliated cells and you increase the production of mucus, at least from the goblet cells, then you don't have a mechanism to cleanse the lung of the excess mucus because of the reduction in cilia, leaving cough as an alternative mechanism for clearing the lung of the excess mucus, hence chronic bronchitis. But chronic bronchitis is not equivalent to COPD. So COPD the diagnosis of COPD depends on spirometry. It needs to be confirmed by the presence of significant airflow obstruction. So what is the evidence that habitual marijuana smoking impairs lung function to produce obstructive ventilatory impairment? So here there are more studies, but there are not that many. There are a dozen systematic assessments. These are mostly cross-sectional. There are a few longitudinal of the relationship between regular marijuana use and lung function abnormality, adjusting for tobacco, or actually just comparing marijuana-only smokers to non-smokers. And so if we look at the FEV1, we see that there's only one study that shows a reduction. That was only in ex-smokers rather than current smokers of marijuana. One study showed an increase. So in general, there's no reduction in FEV1. If we look at the major metric for airflow obstruction is FEV1-FVC ratio. So there are 4 studies that show a reduction, well, actually 5, in FEV1-FVC ratio. But it has been proposed that this is a spurious reduction due to the associated increase in the vital capacity. So when you smoke marijuana, you take deep breaths, hold your breath for about 16 seconds rather than 3 seconds, which is typical for tobacco, and this can actually stretch the lung, analogous to what we see in swimmers who tend to have high vital capacities, and that could spuriously reduce the ratio. If we look at specific airway conductance, this was done in 4 studies, including one of ours. There is a modest reduction, about 25%, which probably is not clinically significant, and the reason probably relates to the swelling and vascular congestion that we saw in an earlier slide in regular smokers of marijuana. And then finally, the diffusing capacity, whenever it was measured, it was found to be normal. How about, so with regard to emphysema, so the DCO is a rather sensitive, although non-specific marker of emphysema. So HRCT is probably more sensitive. And there have only been 2 studies, HRC studies, in marijuana smokers compared to controls. And only in 1 out of 75 was there evidence of macroscopic emphysema. And more recently, in a study coming from spiromics, and I was part of the study, these were, to get into spiromics, you had to be, well, most were smokers. So we really looked at marijuana use on top of tobacco smoking and compared current or former marijuana use with never marijuana use. And ironically, or paradoxically, the percent emphysema was actually lower in the current marijuana smokers versus the never marijuana smokers, which happened to be statistically significant. Also, there was a little bit less air trapping. And if you may be concerned, well, maybe there's some confounding by associated tobacco use, but the changes were actually independent of concomitant tobacco use. So now COPD is a progressive disease characterized by an accelerated rate of decline in FEV1 over time. What is the evidence that marijuana smoking, even if the cross-sectional studies are not that suggestive of significant airflow obstruction, could there be an accelerated rate of loss of lung function over time in relation to marijuana smoking? And there are actually 3 cross-longitudinal studies, and this is ours. So marijuana smoking is alone is in green, and we studied a number of habitual marijuana smokers compared to non-smokers and tobacco smokers and combined smokers. And there was the rate of decline in FEV1 over 8 years was similar in the marijuana smokers to the non-smokers, whereas it was accelerated in the tobacco smokers. And if you look at dose response, we had pretty heavy, to get into our study, you had to smoke at least daily for at least 5 years. And most patients, most subjects had more than 50 joint years lifetime cumulative use of marijuana. That's a joint years, a joint a day times the number of years smoked. No dose response for marijuana with regard to the rate of decline in lung function. It's another study from New Zealand. It was a birth cohort. So these are subjects studied from birth up to age 36. And the spirometry was performed beginning at age 18 and then several times thereafter until age 36. And between 18 and 36, we saw an increase in FEV1, greater increase in FVC in relation to cannabis use without a significant reduction in the ratio. The numeric reduction was not significant, probably because of the elevated FVC, but with tobacco smokers, there's a reduction in both FEV1 and the ratio. So in summary, with respect to the risk for COPD, we do see chronic bronchitis. We don't see any compelling evidence of loss of lung function that would be consistent with COPD. On the other hand, most of the published studies actually examined relatively younger smokers, smokers in their 30s or 40s, but we really need further studies in older smokers with a longer duration of marijuana use to see whether or not there might be a negative impact or deleterious impact on their predisposition to COPD, which is a disease of aging. So what about lung cancer? So there are several lines of evidence for a link between marijuana use and respiratory and lung cancer, including head and neck cancer. I'm not going to show those data. And there are other lines of evidence against a link. Let's look at the evidence for a link. Well, we already saw this, that there is an increase in the concentration of PAHs in marijuana smoke. We also see widespread histopathologic changes in the marijuana smokers, including squamous metaplasia and nuclear abnormalities. which have been shown back in the 1950s. Auerbach published a landmark paper demonstrating that these changes are precursors to the subsequent development of lung cancer in tobacco smokers. If you, we did biopsies of the bronchial mucosa in a large number of marijuana smokers, the smokers of both marijuana and tobacco only, and found an and we actually looked for, we used immunohistology to look at the protein products of the genes that are involved in lung carcinogenesis. And we found an overexpression of epidermal growth factor receptor and Ki-67, the nuclear proliferation protein, in the marijuana smokers compared to both the non-smokers and tobacco smokers even. So here we see the prevalence of these proteins, these oncoproteins, Ki-67, EGFR, and the marijuana-only smokers, higher, certainly higher, significantly higher than non-smokers, and higher even than the tobacco-only smokers. A more recent study looked at biopsies, laryngeal biopsies from patients with laryngeal cancer, related it to their, and actually measured, looked at expression of EGFR and downstream oncoproteins in relation to their history of smoking marijuana. And we see that the cannabis smokers had the highest expression of these oncoproteins, higher than non-smokers and even higher than tobacco cigarette smokers. So what about clinical evidence? So there are some small case series of a relatively high proportion of regular marijuana smokers among young people under the age of 40 or 45. It's unusual to develop lung cancer under that age, who had longer upper airway cancer in relation to the proportion of marijuana smokers in the general population. Then there were some older, but of course case series are observational studies and they don't imply causality. Epidemiologic studies are better evidence for cause and effect, but they're not conclusive either. So here are a couple older epidemiologic studies. These are case control studies from North Africa that did show a marked increased risk, the association of marijuana with lung cancer. But in North Africa, when cannabis is smoked, it's always smoked together with tobacco in a kiff, and you can't disentangle the effects of tobacco from those of marijuana. So the evidence against the link is fairly considerable or compelling. So there have been a number of studies demonstrating an anti-tumoral effect of THC using experimental animals, not humans, experimental animals and cell culture systems with a variety of cancers: lung, glioma, thyroid, lymphoma, skin, breast, prostate, etc., that uniformly show a suppression in tumor growth, presumably because of certain anti-tumoral properties of marijuana, of THC, including an anti-mitogenic effect, a pro-apoptotic effect, anti-angiogenic effect, but there have not been any human studies, to my knowledge, clinical trials, for example, to see what the efficacy might be in human cancer. So there are also some older epidemiologic studies that show a negative or no effect of marijuana with relation to respiratory cancer, including all tobacco-related cancers and oral cancer, all of which were negative. And these were well-done studies. And there were 6 case control studies that have been published looking at the association between marijuana smoking and lung cancer. 5 of the 6 showed no increased risk, maybe even a slight tendency to decreased risk. Only 1 study showed an increased risk, and that was a study from New Zealand in which the increased risk was seen only in the highest tertile of marijuana smoking in terms of the quantity of smoke. There were only 4 cases in that tertile, so I think that those estimates were probably, they're certainly imprecise and they're probably overinflated. And then lastly, with regard to lung cancer, there was a highly quoted study out of Sweden that looked at the risk for developing lung cancer over a 40-year follow-up period following the administration of a questionnaire to military recruits at the age of 19 or 20. asking them about their marijuana use and tobacco use, et cetera, alcohol, et cetera. They were followed for 40 years, and lo and behold, there was more than twofold increased risk of developing lung cancer if you smoke marijuana more than 50 times prior to the age of 19 or 20. The problem is that, it's obvious, there was no lifetime use of cannabis that was actually evaluated, nor was there any lifetime use of tobacco. So you couldn't adjust for true lifetime use of tobacco. The likelihood is, if you're a dual smoker, and we've actually shown this, then if you stop smoking, you're more likely to stop marijuana than tobacco because you're more dependent on tobacco than marijuana. So I think this is a fatal flaw in this study. So I think that the weight of evidence is against, or argues against, the concept that regular marijuana smoking is a risk factor for developing respiratory cancer, either lung cancer or head and neck cancer. I didn't show you the data for head and neck, but it's very similar. So the last question is, does regular marijuana smoking predispose to pneumonia? So you might expect that it might, because we have this increased mucus that you're not clearing well from the lung, that might serve as a substrate for infection. We also harvested alveolar macrophages from bronchoalveolar lavage in habitual marijuana smokers and non-smokers and tobacco smokers, and found that marijuana smokers actually are reduced in their ability, when stimulated, to produce pro-inflammatory cytokines. And these pro-inflammatory cytokines will attract inflammatory cells to the lung that serve a useful purpose if you have infection. So they're part of the host defense system. It's not useful if these are chronically overproduced, that could cause tissue damage. But they're, so it's a two-edged sword. So the fact that these cytokines are not increased, there's no increased production, might protect the lung against tissue damage that might lead to COPD, but on the other hand, it might increase the risk for infection. Also, we found that there is a reduction in the stimulated production of reactive oxygen species when marijuana smokers' macrophages are stimulated, and these would have a beneficial effect with regard to microbial killing. So we actually did find that when you co-culture alveolar macrophages from marijuana smokers with Staph aureus, that there was a significant reduction in bacterial killing compared to macrophages from tobacco smokers and non-smokers. And so an effector molecule for killing bacteria, and it's produced, you need to produce nitric oxide synthase to convert arginine to nitric oxide. Inducible nitric oxide synthase requires cytokines, pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are reduced from marijuana smokers. If you add GM-CSF to the media, you do restore the ability to kill bacteria. So, okay, so that's the background evidence that suggests that at least hypothetically there might be an increased risk for pneumonia, and there are some clinical studies in the past that actually support that hypothesis. We know that marijuana has been shown to be contaminated with Aspergillus, gram-negative bacteria. We know that there are a number of case reports of Aspergillus pneumonia in patients who are immunocompromised for a variety of reasons, including AIDS. And there are older epidemiologic studies that actually suggested that patients with HIV patients are more likely to develop pneumonia-acquired pneumonia and opportunistic infection if they smoke marijuana, but the results are mixed. So we decided to do a study using the multi-center AIDS cohort, which is a 4-center study supported by the NIAID. And it's a study, ongoing prospective study of gay men regarding the natural history of HIV. And so the findings, because of the time, is controlling for relevant covariants, including tobacco, ethnicity, age, other illicit drug use. We did not find any association between marijuana use and the development of non-PCP or community-acquired pneumonia. In the HIV negative subgroup of this population, the HIV positive subgroup, We also, if they if we failed to find any association with of marijuana with the risk of pneumonia, we did see an association with low CD4 counts, as you would expect, and we did see a high tobacco positive control that showed increased risk. And then with regard to PCP pneumonia, again, marijuana did not increase the risk of developing PCP pneumonia in this immunocompromised patients. So, in summary, the habitual marijuana smoking does not appear to increase the risk of pneumonia, even in individuals immunosuppressed due to HIV infection. So, lastly, there are some miscellaneous some observations, case theories that marijuana smokers who develop bullae and also pneumothorax and pneumomediastinum, but we really need, because we don't know what the prevalence of these complications are is in the general population, so we need large-scale case control studies. I don't think they're going to carry it out to test the significance of the association between marijuana and barotrauma and bullous lung disease. And with that, I will stop, and thank you. Thank you. So, time is up, but if any of you want to ask questions, please come forward. Sorry. You know what? I have to. Thank you.
Hey, Srihari. Yeah. So, you were downstairs probably after I left. When did you join 96? Yeah, so 93 to 96. Yes.